we're jumping ahead, but it says the shepherd pulled the flute out of his pocket. And it's like, well, why does he have the flute?
Yeah.
He took it from the underworld.
Where did he stick it when he was a frog? Answer me that. Mythological master.
Yeah, okay. So that's the bonus question, right? That's our listeners. If you can answer that question, tell us, how he hid the... There's an old joke in there somewhere.
Yeah.
But answer that riddle there. Where did he put the flute while he was a frog? That's hilarious. So I was watching a documentary the other night. My wife wanted to watch it. I don't know. Have you seen the documentary? It's on Amazon Prime, and it's a documentary about Nashville songwriters.
Oh, okay. No, it's right up the road from me, so no, I need to watch that.
Oh, yeah. It's interesting. My wife wanted to watch it, and I was like, well, okay, we can watch it. And in a lot of ways, it was really inspiring. I really enjoyed it. But, all these songwriters, there's an entire industry of songwriters behind all the songs you hear, right? Because a lot of artists don't write their own music.
Right.
And so it's just a fascinating look behind all these names that you probably never heard of. Some of them have written for years, and they're just trying to get that one big hit. And there was one songwriter that he's got 21 number one hits to his name. I'm like, well, okay, that guy knows what he's doing. And yet you've never heard of him.
Right.
You know what I mean?
But he's a master storyteller.
Yeah, exactly. And all he wants to do is write. And that seemed to be a common theme. They're musicians too, but most of them, they're like, I just want to write songs. I don't even got to record them. I just want to write them. So there was this one interesting story that this guy, and this was a while ago, and you'll know when you hear the song, and he was not selling any music. He's not selling any songs. This is all he wants to do, though. And he had called his dad and said, I think about giving up. I might move back home. And he said, no, son, you're doing what you're supposed to do. He's like, don't stop believing. And hung up with his dad, And the guy goes, hey, that's a catchy lyric.
There you go. That's
and you already know.
Sure, that's all you got to say. That's right.
Right?
Yeah, sure.
One of the most iconic hits of the 80s, Don't Stop Believing, by Journey. Yeah. So
but I was thinking a country song. But clearly not, right?
Journey, yeah. So it's and I think someone even rejected it, got passed around, and then his agent called and said, "Hey, the band Journey wants to try to record this." And there you go. Don't Stop Believing. That's where we get it.
Yeah, the rest is history.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, that's pretty cool, man. Yeah, well, it's just that iconic sound, but you need the story to go behind it.
Yeah, and it just took that one little phrase, and that guy ran with it. And I like interesting stories behind all the songs and the bands and all stuff like that. But actually, it was a really inspiring documentary. So
I'll have to check that out. Okay. What's the name of it? Or do you remember?
It's something. No, I don't remember it. I should have just Googled it. It all begins with a song.
It all begins with a song. There you go. I just found that one. Okay.
Yep. It all begins with a song. That's what it's called.
Okay, cool. Yeah. I'll add that to my list. Yeah. Well, that makes sense because a great story is captivating. It grabs your attention. It's funny that country music especially really fixates on the story. It wants a good story. I'm sure there are nonsensical country music songs, but it's not like rock where some of it's just the beat and it's the electric guitar, things like that. You got to have a good hook and a good story. But to kind of what we're doing with all the fairy tale stuff, that ties in pretty well.
Yeah, that is a tie-in. I didn't really have a purpose behind telling that story. I just thought it was an interesting story. But now that you say it, I guess that's the tie-in, is the good storytelling. And, of course, we're in this series on good stories, right? The fairy tales. So today we're going to do a great one. I think you and I both
it's my favorite.
Said repeatedly we enjoy this one. It's called The Nix of the Mill Pond.
Yeah.
And we will walk through this fairy tale. But before we do, we've been doing a little bit of introducing symbolism in fairy tales, how to interpret fairy tales as a wider idea of, look, how do you interpret or how do you read things like Greek mythology? How do you read parables in the Bible or a lot of the Old Testament stories that have a lot of these elements, right?
Right.
In them. So I was thinking about this and kind of tying together a lot of the things we've been talking about. When you, at least one way I learned how to study the Bible as you are reading a new book of the Bible, right? Say you're sitting down, you're going to read Psalms, or they really lend themselves to Paul's letters in the New Testament. So there's questions you ask before you start, which is, who wrote the book? I don't know if you've heard this. Who wrote the book? Who was it written to? When was it written? And why was it written?
Right.
And if you can kind of answer those four questions up front, then it provides a little bit of context for what you're about to read.
Right.
And so I was thinking about that in terms of fairy tales, because I was thinking there's almost a list of questions that you could come up with that almost apply to any of these Grimm's fairy tales. So we can just run through them real quick. But I thought it'd be helpful to say, here's some questions you should ask or could ask if you really want to understand a fairy tale. First of all, what's the status quo state, right? Or what's the current state?
Okay.
Every fairy tale, right, seems to say, here's the way things are right now.
Right.
So, yeah, I thought it's good to just clarify that. And in fact, you and I were talking a little bit beforehand, and we started talking about the status quo state, right?
Yeah.
Of the one we're going to talk about.
Yeah.
And I didn't really think about it that much because it sets the table, and then you get into the story and you kind of forgot this is the way things were. But so that's the first question.
Well, I think
What's
we
the
mentioned,
status quo?
I think we mentioned before about that when you journey to another kingdom, it's not just the next city over. It's usually a different way of thinking. You've gone over to something else and have changed the way you think. And it's either better or worse. And then a lot of times you move to the other kingdom. So it's kind of different states of mind a little bit. Your current state is a certain way of the status quo of it. And then most fairy tales are about transition, obviously it's about a lesson. Sure. And it's whether we learn from it and live happily ever after, or like the fisherman and his wife, we don't learn from it and there they sit to this very day. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Okay, so that's a good first question. All right, what's the second one?
Okay. Second one is, what's the triggering event, or what's the event that prompts a change in the status quo? Right? So every fairy tale almost has everything's going along fine, or maybe not going along fine, and then something kind of intervenes in the characters' lives and is going to prompt some kind of transition or change, right?
Okay.
So what's the triggering event?
Okay.
So go back to the fisherman and his wife. The triggering event is he catches this enchanted flounder.
Yeah, the magic flounder. Okay.
And you could just go through all of them and say, here's the triggering event, right?
Right.
Okay, so the third one, and we've said this almost every time, where is the wilderness? And we've talked about how the wilderness represents chaos, but it also represents opportunity. And it is interesting to me that in almost every one of these fairy tales we've talked about, there is a sense of there's a wilderness out there that someone has to traverse.
Yeah. Well, this is the hero's journey, or every Marvel movie has that moment where, they get the new power and whatever. Spider-Man can do his spider stuff, but it's almost like they don't know how to use it. And so they kind of fumble it around, and they do some good, but they also don't quite know how to harness the power. And they almost win, but then they get in their own way and they kind of fall back to the ground. And then there's this renewed understanding of their purpose. And now they can really fight evil. They never just go out and fight evil and win. Evil kind of has to knock them down a peg. And that whole process is the wilderness. That's going out in the wilderness. That's facing your dragon. And it's that learning aspect of, how do I harness this new power? And so, that kind of represents that. Right.
Yeah, and I think these probably very much mirror the hero's journey. But so where's the wilderness? We talked about the sea in the last episode.
Right.
That was the wilderness, right? Little Red Riding Hood, the wilderness was the forest that the big bad wolf lived in.
Right.
So in every one of these, you can pick out the wilderness. All right, so the next question then is, what's the quest that must be undertaken? And this is, again, it's the hero's journey, right?
Mm-hmm, sure.
Circumstances require that someone in the story has to kind of take this quest on that's going to be difficult for them. And we'll see that in today's story.
Right.
Also.
Okay.
And then the final one would be, how is society transformed? This is something else we've talked about as well, because once the quest is undertaken and it's completed, or like the fisherman and his wife, it's not completed.
Right.
Like, how is society transformed, right? And so we talked about how a lot of times when the king marries the princess, that wedding represents a new society. Society has been transformed.
Yeah, a new start. It's not merely a wedding. It's a shift in the way you think. And yes, society starts anew.
Yeah. So I don't know. Those are just, you could come up with a whole list. I think of the hero's journey, there's like 12 or 15 steps that you could probably mirror, but just as a simplified list, I thought that was kind of an interesting set of questions to say, all right, as you're listening to this story, think about these elements, right?
No, that's helpful, because a lot of times you hear these stories and they throw you a lot of curveballs, stuff come from out of left field, talking flounder, all these strange things happen. You're like, where did that come from? But you're right. If you kind of have that general framework for understanding these stories as the story's being read, and you and I talked about this last week, you and I read these stories 5-10 times before we come up with a lot of the insights that we have on them. So we kind of recognize that it's not fair to give the listener first shot of this thing and then immediately, like they're supposed to break all this down. But it is helpful if you have that framework, you can kind of follow along with, okay, this is not just the sea, this is the wilderness. This is his, wilderness journey. And you're right, you can kind of follow along that way. And it probably is helpful in kind of breaking it down as you go.
Yeah, and I think a lot of these even apply to a lot of the stories you read in the Bible.
Sure.
Especially in the Old Testament. I mean, think of pick any Old Testament story. Jonah and the whale, right?
Right.
You could go down these list of 5 questions, and you could say, okay, what's the status quo, right? What's the triggering event? Where's the wilderness? Well, the wilderness was the belly of the whale, right?
Mm-hmm.
What's the quest that must be undertaken? Jonah runs, but he has to face the call that God has put on him, right?
Right.
And then how is society transformed? And I think it says Nineveh repented, and at least that generation of Ninevites, turned to Yahweh.
Right.
Actually, and Jonah's not very happy about it.
Right. But they avoided God's wrath. So, society transformed there.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, I don't know. I thought that was helpful.
No, that is helpful. I like that. All right. So, how are we going to apply that to this one? Are we going to have to point these things out now?
Well, I guess we can keep them in mind, but let's listen to it first. And let's have these in the back of our heads. And as we encounter them in the story, we can point them out because I think these apply to most of them. All right.
Okay. So is there anything that you want to say before we listen to the Nix of the Mill Pond? Anything you want to point out?
I don't know that I'll point out a lot. I'll just point out what a Nix is because
that's helpful.
Because we may be sitting here going, the Nix of the Mill Pond and people going, I don't, what, the New York Knicks?
Yeah, that's right.
They make the playoffs?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, when you read it,
what's a Knicks?
N-I-X. That's right. It is N-I-X. Okay.
And realize that most people are listening, so they're going, what are they saying? Knicks? What is this, But N-I-X, yes, you're right. And sometimes it's referred to as a Nixie, N-I-X-I-E.
Right.
But it's basically a water spirit, and it's known as not being a very friendly water spirit. But back in those days, or back in ancient times, a lot of natural things had a spirit associated with them.
Right.
So a Nix is a water spirit. It's kind of a malevolent water spirit, as I understand it. Have you understood anything differently than that?
Yeah.
They're not very friendly.
Right. A water fairy, and usually kind of has a dual nature, meaning it's kind of inviting, sort of like the sirens in the Odyssey, right? That they're inviting, they draw you in, but then there's always kind of a bargain, the Faustian bargain that comes with it.
Sure.
And that's certainly what we're going to see in this story.
Yeah, so that's probably the main thing I would point out before we got started, is just understanding what a Nix is. Because even as you hear the story being read, it's going to be talking about this Nix or Nixie or water Nix. And so that's what that is referring to. Anything else that you can think of to point out before we get started?
I don't know. I say this every time, but every detail matters. So if there's a strange detail that you're like, why was it that specific, or why do you this didn't make a whole lot of sense, make a note of that because it certainly plays into it. And as far as I can tell, I think I've at least to my satisfaction, all the details make sense once you kind of plug in what this narrative is about. And so, pay attention to the details and enjoy the story.
There was once upon a time a miller who lived with his wife in great contentment. They had money and land, and their prosperity increased year by year more and more. But ill luck comes like a thief in the night. As their wealth had increased, so did it again decrease year by year. And at last the miller could hardly call the mill in which he lived his own. He was in great distress, and when he lay down after his hard day's work, found no rest, but tossed about in his bed full of care. One morning he rose before daybreak and went out into the open air, thinking that perhaps there his heart might become lighter. As he was stepping over the mill dam, the first sunbeam was just breaking forth, and he heard a rippling sound in the pond. He turned round and perceived a beautiful woman rising slowly out of the water. Her long hair, which she was holding off her shoulders with her soft hands, fell down on both sides and covered her white body. He soon saw that she was the nix of the mill pond, and in his fright he did not know whether he should run away or stay where he was. But the nix made her sweet voice heard, called him by his name, and asked him why he was so sad. The miller was at first struck dumb, but when he heard her speak so kindly, he took heart and told her how he had formerly lived in wealth and happiness, but that now he was so poor that he did not know what to do. "Be easy," answered the nix. "I will make thee richer and happier than thou hast ever been before. Only thou must promise to give me the young thing which has been born just now in thy house." What else could that be, thought the miller, but a young puppy or kitten? And he promised her what she desired. The nix descended into the water again, and he hurried back to his mill, consoled and in good spirits. He had not yet reached it when the maidservant came out of the house and cried to him to rejoice, for his wife had just given birth to a little boy. The miller stood as if struck by lightning. He saw very well that the cunning nix had been aware of it and had cheated him. Hanging his head, he went up to his wife's bedside, and when she said, "Why do you not rejoice over the fine boy?" he told her what had befallen him and what kind of promise he had given the nix. "Of what use to me are riches and prosperity," he added, "if I am to lose my child? But what can I do?" Even our family, who had come hither to wish them joy, did not know what to say to them. In the meantime, prosperity again returned to the miller's house. All that he undertook succeeded. It was as if presses and coffers filled themselves of their own accord, and as if money multiplied nightly in the cupboards. It was not long before his wealth was greater than it had ever been before, but he could not rejoice over it untroubled, for the bargain which he had made with the nix tormented his soul. Whenever he passed the mill pond, he feared she might ascend and remind him of his debt. He never let the boy himself go near the water. "Beware," he said to him, "if thou dost but touch the water, a hand will rise, seize thee, and draw thee down." But as year after year went by, and the nix did not show herself again, the miller began to feel at ease. The boy grew up to be a youth and was apprenticed to a huntsman. When he had learned everything and had become an excellent huntsman, the lord of the village took him into his service. In the village lived a beautiful and true-hearted maiden who pleased the huntsman, and when his master perceived that, he gave him a little house. The two were married, lived peacefully and happily, and loved each other with all their hearts. One day, the huntsman was chasing a roe, and when the animal turned aside from the forest into the open country, he pursued it and at last shot it. He did not notice that he was now in the neighborhood of the dangerous mill pond, and went, after he had disemboweled the stag, to the water in order to wash his blood-stained hands. Scarcely, however, had he dipped them in than the nix ascended, smilingly wound her dripping arms around him, and drew him quickly down under the waves, which closed over him. When it was evening and the huntsman did not return home, his wife became alarmed. She went out to seek him, and as he had often told her that he had to be on his guard against the snares of the nix, and dared not venture into the neighborhood of the mill pond, she already suspected what had happened. She hastened to the water, and when she found his hunting pouch lying on the shore, she could no longer have any doubt of his misfortune. Lamenting her sorrow and wringing her hands, she called on her beloved by name, but in vain. She hurried across to the other side of the pond and called him anew. She reviled the nix with harsh words, but no answer followed. The surface of the water remained calm. Only the crescent moon stared steadily back at her. The poor woman did not leave the pond. With hasty steps, she paced round and round it, without resting a moment, sometimes in silence, sometimes uttering a loud cry, sometimes softly sobbing. At last her strength came to an end. She sank down on the ground and fell into a heavy sleep. Presently a dream took possession of her. She was anxiously climbing upwards between great masses of rock. Thorns and briars caught her feet. The rain beat her in the face, and the wind tossed her long hair about. When she had reached the summit, quite a different sight presented itself to her. The sky was blue, the air soft, the ground sloped gently downward, and on a green meadow, gay with flowers of every color, stood a pretty cottage. She went up to it and opened the door. There sat an old woman with white hair, who beckoned to her kindly. At that very moment the poor woman awoke. Day had already dawned, and she at once resolved to act in accordance with her dream. She laboriously climbed the mountain. Everything was exactly as she had seen it in the night. The woman received her kindly and pointed out a chair on which she might sit. "Thou must have met with a misfortune," she said, "since thou hast sought out my lonely cottage." With tears the woman related what had befallen her. "Be comforted," said the old woman. "I will help thee. Here is a golden comb for thee. Tarry here till the full moon has risen, then go to the mill pond, seat thyself on the shore, and comb thy long black hair with this comb. When thou hast done, lay it down on the bank, and thou wilt see what will happen." The woman returned home, but the time till the full moon came passed slowly. At last the shining disk appeared in the heavens. Then she went out to the mill pond, sat down, and combed her long black hair with the golden comb. And when she had finished, she laid it down at the water's edge. It was not long before there was a movement in the depths. A wave rose, rolled to the shore, and bore the comb away with it. In not more time than necessary for the comb to sink to the bottom, the surface of the water parted, and the head of the huntsman arose. He did not speak, but looked at his wife with sorrowful glances. At the same instant, a second wave came rushing up and covered the man's head. All had vanished. The mill pond lay peaceful as before, and nothing but the face of the full moon shone on it. Full of sorrow, the woman went back, but again the dream showed her the cottage of the old woman. Next morning she again set out and complained of her woes to the wise woman. The old woman gave her a golden flute and said, "Tarry till the full moon comes again, then take this flute, play a beautiful air on it, and when thou hast finished, lay it on the sand. Then thou wilt see what will happen." The wife did as the old woman told her. No sooner was the flute lying on the sand than there was a stirring in the depths, and a wave rushed up and bore the flute away with it. Immediately afterwards the water parted, and not only the head of the man, but half of his body also arose. He stretched out his arms longingly towards her, but a second wave came up, covered him, and drew him down again. "Alas, what does it profit me," said the unhappy woman, "that I should see my beloved only to lose him again?" Despair filled her heart anew, but the dream led her a third time to the house of the old woman. She set out, and the wise woman gave her a golden spinning wheel, consoled her, and said, "All is not yet fulfilled. Tarry until the time of the full moon, then take the spinning wheel, seat thyself on the shore, and spin the spool full. And when thou hast done that, place the spinning wheel near the water, and thou wilt see what happens." The woman obeyed all she said exactly. As soon as the full moon showed itself, she carried the golden spinning wheel to the shore and span industriously until the flax came to an end and the spool was quite filled with threads. No sooner was the wheel standing on the shore than there was more violent movement than before in the depths of the pond, and a mighty wave rushed up and bore the wheel away with it. Immediately the head and the whole body of the man rose into the air in a waterspout. He quickly sprang to the shore, caught his wife by the hand, and fled. But they had scarcely gone a very little distance when the whole pond rose with a frightful roar and streamed out over the open country. The fugitives already saw death before their eyes when the woman, in her terror, implored the help of the old woman, and in an instant they were transformed, she into a toad, he into a frog. The flood, which had overtaken them, could not destroy them, but it tore them apart and carried them far away. When the water had dispersed and they both touched dry land again, they regained their human form, but neither knew where the other was. They found themselves among strange people who did not know their native land. High mountains and deep valleys lay between them. In order to keep themselves alive, they were both obliged to tend sheep. For many long years they drove their flocks through the field and forest and were full of sorrow and longing. When spring had once more broken forth on the earth, they both went out one day with their flocks, and as chance would have it, they drew near each other. They met in a valley, but did not recognize each other. Yet they rejoiced that they were no longer so lonely. Henceforth they each day drove their flocks to the same place. They did not speak much, but they felt comforted. One evening, when the full moon was shining in the sky and the sheep were already at rest, the shepherd pulled the flute out of his pocket and played on it a beautiful but sorrowful air. When he had finished, he saw that the shepherdess was weeping bitterly. "Why art thou weeping?" he asked. "Alas," answered she, "thus shone the full moon when I played this air on the flute for the last time, and the head of my beloved rose out of the water." He looked at her, and it seemed as if a veil fell from his eyes, and he recognized his dear wife, and when she looked at him and the moon shone in his face, she knew him also. They embraced and kissed each other, and no one need ask if they were happy.
Hey, we got to say also, thanks to your wife, Amy, because she's been recording all these stories. We were playing around with AI-generated voices and trying to get those British accents, but you were saying it just wasn't. In a fairy tale, you have these conversations and different characters, and an AI-generated voice just wasn't capturing it. But it's been nice to have a motherly voice. I was listening to one of our previous episodes today, and I just had to stop my work and go sit in my chair and, listen to a fairy tale read by your wife. So,
you just fall asleep
for doing that.
No, she is a master. She's been doing this she's an English teacher by trade anyway, but she's certainly read many stories to our kids, and she's kind of known for doing the voices and... You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Just really capturing the story. And you're right about the AI. I wanted to mess with that. And there were moments that the AI was really, really impressive, but it just couldn't capture dialogue, when there's speaking parts, things like that. It was all the same voice, and it could never distinguish. It just fell flat. It didn't quite work like we wanted. But anyway, so yes, she did a great job. But yes, this is by far my favorite fairy tale. I've read it multiple times, and I notice something new about it every time. And it's one of those stories that once you understand what it's about, everything falls right into place, and every detail means something, like I said in the beginning. But I also like it just because it's just about life, man. It's about family baggage. It's about finding balance. It's about falling in love. It's about getting distracted with the busyness of life and then rediscovering the person you fell in love with, right? It's about all those things. So yeah, it's about life. And so as we jump in, I don't know if you got that vibe from it the first time you read it, but the first time I read it, I certainly didn't understand all the details, but I got that kind of feeling like, man, this is about something. Obviously, the falling in love and then being separated and the being reunited at the end, it gave me that vibe like, man, this has got to be about marriage or something like that. What was your first impression the first time you heard it?
I think I had a similar reaction because the first time I read this, I remember it gripped me because I was thinking there's a lot going on here.
Right.
But I didn't have a good grasp of what it all meant. You know, I kind of had this high level, I think it means this, but then when you start talking about the little elements and the symbolic elements here we'll cover in a minute, I didn't have a good feel for that, but it pulled me in because I knew there was a lot going on in this story, and I knew that there was a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
So that was my reaction.
Yeah. Well, and it was one of those things that I almost couldn't wait to reread because I'm like, okay, let me really dig into this because I know, the symbolism of the comb and the flute and the spinning wheel. You knew it meant something, but it wasn't really intuitive right away. It didn't just like fall in your lap. So you got to do a little bit of work with this one. But man, this is a flawless story. This is a wonderful story once you kind of understand. So where do you want to start with this?
Yeah, well, we usually start out by talking about just mentioning the symbolic elements, and we will just throw them out here for a minute. But I think this story really lends itself to just jumping in and talking about it, because obviously the symbolic elements are what you just mentioned, the big ones. There's the comb, there's the flute, and there's the spinning wheel.
Mm-hmm.
And boy, those were head scratchers for me. Like, it's just so random. Set a gold spinning wheel on the shore.
Right.
And you just go, what is that about? Right. So those are the symbolic elements. I guess we could also mention a reoccurring character, which is the old lady who represents what we said before, divine wisdom, right? Mm-hmm. It's that connection to the divine. She has to ascend a mountain. So that symbolism is definitely very strong in this one. And I enjoyed that. We talked about the Knicks. What else? Or should we just jump in?
Yeah, I say we just take it from the top. This kind of lends itself to where it kind of lays itself out when you take it from the top. Not all of them do that. We were talking about that before. This is a good one because you really can just start from the beginning and start to unfold it. And when you dig into some of the elements right off the bat, it starts to make sense for the rest of the story moving forward. So, yeah, starts off with a miller.
Yeah. And if we start with our question of what is the status quo, this story actually gives you a backstory, right? And it very intentionally says, here's how these events came about, and this backstory is very important to understanding the rest of it. But yeah, like you said, there's a miller and he has a mill. And I think you got more out of this than I did because I tend to just jump right into all these other elements. But yeah, so we have a miller and a mill. So what's going on with that?
Well, I kind of discovered that a mill worker in fairy tales represents, and I didn't realize this, but it makes sense. It kind of represents a lack of resourcefulness, maybe a touch of laziness, because mills in those days, it's a water mill and the river is turning the water wheel, and then inside you use that force to cut wood or whatever you're doing with it, right? They generate electricity now, things like that. But anyway, all the work was done by the water. And so the current of the river turns and powers the mill. So I guess you could say it was considered kind of the desk job of the old world. You just kind of step back and let the water do the work. And you and I have desk jobs, so.
Yeah, sounds pretty resourceful to me. I'm not going to lie. But,
yeah,
But yeah, I could see how it might be perceived as everyone's out working in the field with their hands and you're just kind of kicked back watching the mill do all the work. I could kind of see that before the industrialization of everything kind of took place and that became normal.
Yeah. And of course, when we look back at any job, I'm sure working in a mill was hot and sweaty work, things like that. But I think as far as our story is concerned, the mill represents something like unearned success. And to this story, it symbolizes kind of a life of inertia, right? Letting the current do all the work. So the miller isn't just lazy. He's disconnected, right? That moment where he fails to realize that his wife, I know I'm jumping ahead here, but that he fails to realize that his wife has given birth is this crazy picture of just complete, emotional absenteeism, right? So it plays into the mill itself and the miller, what he does.
Okay, yeah, I can see that. And so then to set the stage, so we have the miller and the mill, and things were going pretty well for a while. Right? And then it said, but ill luck comes like a thief in the night. I like that phrase.
Yeah, I thought it was cool.
And so then all of a sudden he hits a down streak, right?
Right.
His wealth decreases for a while. And he gets to the point one day where he says, I've got to turn things around. So he goes out one morning at the first sunbeam. And of course, you have the mill right next to the pond. That's where this idea of the mill pond comes in.
Mm-hmm.
And he turns around and he perceived a beautiful woman rising slowly out of the water. And it describes this water nix. And he recognizes her as the nix of the mill pond.
Right.
And she basically says, what's troubling you, right? And so he says, I've been down on my luck. Things were good for a while, but I've hit a bad streak here. And she makes a bargain with him. She said, I will make thee richer and happier than thou hast ever been before. Only thou must promise to give me the young thing which has just been born in thy house. Now, if that's not a setup for what's about to happen.
Oh, gosh. Yeah. And so I want to point out the water nix, and we talked about it before, the water fairy, the water spirit. But
yeah,
that water in stories always has a dual nature, right? It's understood as opportunity, but it's also kind of disorder and chaos, right? A little water keeps you from dying from thirst, but too much of it drowns you. And so you can see this Nyx as a goddess of this balance, right? And that's pretty much the role she plays in this story. And so I just want to point out this cool connection between the miller and the Nyx, because the water that powers his mill is the same water that this chaos monster lives in, right? So it's like a two-sided coin. It does the hard work and actually provides power to the mill, but it also brings about this generational curse, right? And so I want to point that out because I think the beginning of this story, maybe it's throughout the story, but certainly the beginning is all about trade-offs, right? It seems to be about that. There's several elements that point that out.
And I'm glad you brought that up because we're talking about medieval times here when you often associated natural phenomenon with spirits behind them.
Right.
Right. So it actually, the more I think about it, it's really interesting because it actually makes sense that if you're trying to harness something in nature, like the mechanics of a water wheel and using a stream or a pond to power it, right? Or talking about harnessing fire, maybe, or something else,
right,
like that. There is this sense in the ancient mindset of, as you're trying to harness this natural energy, you are also, you could say, making a bargain with the spirit behind it.
Yeah.
And so I think you're exactly right. The water Nyx actually represents this bargain with, what would you say? This bargain with the spirit that he has leveraged to power his mill, and only now kind of payment is coming due.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the very thing that gives power to the mill. And so it did. It took me 2 or 3 times to pull this out, but I never associated the actual water going through the water wheel with the water Nyx herself. And that's where that idea, the balance, comes from. And it all being about the trade-offs between those things. And so it's interesting that the water Nyx is completely upfront with the miller also. One of the characteristics of the water Nyx is that they're kind of like Loki.
Like tricksters?
Yeah, trickster. Yeah, there you go. That there's a bit of a trickster element to the water Nyx. At least that's what I had read. But in this one, I thought it was interesting that she's right up front with the guy. He says, I'll make you richer and happier than you've ever been before, but you have to give me the young thing that's just been born in your house. So there's the trade-off. That's the trade that's offered right up front, is essentially prosperity for life, right?
Yeah, and of course, he makes this fatal assumption that what else can it be? It's a puppy or a kitten. Right. So he says, sure, let's do this deal. Right.
Yeah.
Which is so, like, I can't read this without going back to, is it Jephthah in the Judges?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Who makes the foolish vow?
Sure.
And he makes this vow to God and says, if you grant me the victory, the first thing that runs out of my farmstead will be sacrificed to you. And it's the same attitude of what else can it be? It's probably going to be a puppy or a kitten. Right. So
yeah. And
sure, I'll do it. And then his little daughter runs out.
Right.
And he realizes, like, what have I done?
Sure.
And you get the same vibe in this story. I think that's really fascinating.
Yeah, but it kind of points to just this disconnect of what else could it be, a puppy or a kitten, right? But it's almost like, I don't know, there's something more about this trade-off of prosperity for life. It almost lets you know that the miller doesn't see life as very important, or that he at least minimizes it and says, if it's a kitten or a puppy, who cares? Like, that kind of sucks too, even if it was a kitten or a puppy. I'm like, okay, you're just going to trade off your prosperity and just let something die. That doesn't concern you in any way. It obviously turns out to be his son, but even if it's not, I think it just kind of points to, I don't know, the shallowness of the guy, and we're going to talk about balance moving forward. But yeah, that already his life, there's this imbalance. He values wealth too much because he had it and lost it. And he's willing to give up life, any life for it, really. You know what I mean?
Well, there's almost a hint in here, too. And to go ahead and move the story forward, he goes home and his wife has given birth. And it raises the question, well, did you not know that your wife was pregnant?
Oh, sure.
Or maybe she wasn't due for a couple months and she delivered early. These are the kind of things in fairy tales that you just kind of have to, it's the absurd element, right? But there's almost a hint, as you were talking, of it's almost like he maybe even knew in the back of his mind. But this water nix, these water nixes are always this beautiful, almost seductive spirit of the water, and she's offering him fabulous wealth. I could almost see in the back of his mind, he's like, oh, even if it is a kid,
yeah,
it might be this trade. Like in the moment, someone's offering you, $1 million. Well, who knows what you might be willing to sacrifice in that moment, right?
Right.
And there is a sense that this Miller is a bit oblivious to what's going on around him.
Oh, yeah. He's so clueless about what's going on in his own home that he takes the bargain right away. And so I just think it's interesting that trade-off, prosperity for life, is kind of the theme. And we'll see this pattern recur here as the story moves forward. But I just think about that idea that when you're young, you give up your health for wealth. But when you're old, you give up your wealth for health, right? It's that trade-off that when you're young, man, you'll go at it, you'll work late nights to try to build up the bank account to get the bigger house or the nicer car or whatever, the nice vacations, and you'll just work yourself to the bone for that. And then by the time you're old, you've got a nice big bank account and you're spending all your money trying to deal with all your ailments, right? And so it's just that idea of trade-offs that I think it captures really well. I just love the first part of this bargain.
Well, even his response when he goes home is interesting because he says, of what use to me are riches and prosperity, he added, if I'm to lose my child. But then he says, but what can I do? It's like, what am I going to do? So there's kind of this like resignation of what he's done. And we've talked about this in another, I don't know if it's one of these fairy tales or not, but this idea that, you're sacrificing your children, which who would make that bargain? But we do it all the time.
Oh, yeah.
To go to your example, like, well, if I just take that one more business trip and I work overtime and I can provide my family a nice house and I can drive a nice car, and meanwhile your kids are growing up and you're like, okay, finally, I've got to a place where I can enjoy life. And, your kids are probably resentful to you because you were never around.
Right.
And it's like, what did you do? You sacrificed your kid.
Yeah. No, he perfectly represents the guy who's wildly successful at work and makes a ton of money, but he's on his fourth marriage and doesn't know any of his kids. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it just perfectly captures that. Sure.
All right, so let's wrap up. I tend to think of these in acts. I'm learning to think like, okay, this is Act 1. So let's wrap up Act 1. Here's what's happened, and then we can make some final comments on it before moving on. So it says, all that he undertook succeeded. So the Nix promised him wealth, and that's what happens. Mm-hmm. He was wildly wealthy. He's filled his coffers, but he could not rejoice over it because of the bargain he had made, and the Nix tormented his soul, it says. So his son is there. His son is growing up, but then it says, year after year went by, and the Nix did not show herself again. And the miller began to feel at ease, but I would add, he began to think, well, maybe I got away with it, right? And so then the son, to kind of finish this act, the son grows up, and he's a young man now. He trains to be a huntsman, and in the village lived a beautiful and true-hearted maiden, and they got a little house together, they were married, and everyone lives happily ever after.
Right, almost.
Right?
It seems that way. Like they forgot about the bargain, which is another cool way of, when you think about the guy who works too much. I don't think anybody goes into life saying, I'm going to work all the time and ignore my kids. But you just get lulled into it. Sure. You get opportunities at work that take time away from your family maybe. And you just kind of, you forget that you made a bargain, or that when that beautiful son or daughter was born, that you looked down into their eyes and said, I'm going to be the best father in the world to you, and you just forget the bargain, I think. And so life moves on,
Yeah, life moves on. Now your kid's grown. And again, in this days, he's probably a teenager, but he's of marrying age now. So he finds his beautiful young maiden, marries her, and now they have a little house together.
Right.
And anything else about Act 1? And that's kind of the status quo that we talked about in that first question.
Well, okay, so the son, there's two things that we're told about the son, and this is cool. Is first, he's very successful, right? He's an apprentice to this huntsman, and he's so good at it that the lord of the village employs him, right? So he's really successful, like his father, right? But then this other thing that is easy to miss is he's raised to never go near the water, right? And I think and remember what we said about water. That's too little of it, you die, too much of it, you drown. And that's another way of saying that he was raised to avoid the proper balance, right? Because water is about balance. And so those two aspects, when you pick up on that, you're like, oh, wow, the son is just like the dad. He's wildly successful, and he's not very balanced because he's told to never, ever go around the water, right? And I don't know, it just kind of reminds me of the way some people are raised to kind of fear emotion or creativity or even rest, Too much structure and you become too sterile, and too little and you drown. But if you never engage with water at all, you never live. But I don't know, I just kind of have that feeling that the son is a lot like the father, even though it doesn't explicitly say that.
No, that makes sense. I kind of overlooked the idea that the son was also very successful. And so, this is how he grew up, right? He watched his dad, so the son knew about this.
Right.
Because he's aware not to go to the water. So in some sense, you could say the son is kind of aware that his dad made this bargain, right?
Right, yeah.
His dad.
Yeah, how would you like to get that, when you're 10 years old, get mom explaining to you the bargain that was made? You can't, never go near the water, why not? Well, your dad made a bargain with the water fairy and you're going to get sucked down into it. And
The good news is it's been a while. We may be out of the woods here, but your dad basically bargained your soul for his fabulous wealth.
But just in case, never go in the backyard. That's a little bit of a bummer.
But be grateful because you drive a really nice horse, right? Your dad made that happen.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so let's move on to Act 2 then. And again, that next question might be, what's the trigger an event? What's the event that messes up the status quo?
Right.
And we're about to find that out because just really quickly, so the huntsman goes out chasing a roe one day. He's doing what he does. He's tracking a deer. And he's so pursuing this thing, trying to get it, that he loses where he's at and he forgets this idea that he's not supposed to go near water.
Right.
Right? And at last he shot it. He starts to clean it near the water's edge. And then it says, in order to wash his blood-stained hands, there's a lot of imagery there.
Oh, gosh, I love that.
Right? He dips them in the lake and the Nyx ascends. Smilingly wound her dripping arms around him. It's interesting, too. This is really descriptive. She smilingly wound her dripping arms around him and drew him quickly down under the waves, which closed over him.
Okay.
So now the Nyx has got her bargain.
Yep. Here we go. So again, one day he's chasing a roe, right? He pursued it and he shot it, it says. And this is such a great image because he's literally chasing success and he captures what he's pursuing, you know what I mean? And of course, it goes on to say that the water to wash his blood-stained hands, right? How clear is that imagery? He got exactly what he was looking for.
Yeah, that's right. Well, and the blood-stained hands also, because it really makes this idea of like he disemboweled the stag and there's blood everywhere and he has blood-stained hands and he dips them into the water. So the blood is actually representative of, it's the bargain, right? It's the sacrifice that had to be made.
Well, prosperity for life, right? That's the bargain the dad made. Prosperity for life. Yeah. And then it turns out, again, it's a subtle way. It doesn't spell it out for you like it does the father, but the son does the same thing. He's now a slave to the very thing that he pursued, right? Prosperity for life. So he's made the same bargain as his father.
Yeah. And that's captured in this idea of the blood, right?
Right.
The blood-stained hands and the blood dripping into the water. A sacrifice now has to be made because the deal has to be done.
Yeah. So now this is the first glimpse that we get that this story is starting to look like a cautionary tale of work-life imbalance along with a little generational baggage that's been passed down. I mean, what do you think about that? Do you think that's becoming clear here?
Yeah, I think it should be starting to become clear. Yeah. And when you go back then and understand that this is a generational thing, I think it helps to see why this is an issue. Yeah, and then how it affects his new bride, right? Because she realizes he's missing, and she puts two and two together because she's heard the story. So it is funny because everyone knows the story. Everyone knows Dad traded your soul
right
for success, right?
Yeah.
And she even knows that too. So she can see the generational, what you might say, the generational patterns, even generational sin that's being passed down.
Oh, yeah. She's fully aware
realizes
of it.
What's happened. And she sees his stuff by the lake, and she goes, yep, the Knicks got him.
Yep.
Right?
Yep. Yeah, another interesting thing is that when you're reading the story like you would read a book, you would immediately notice, well, we never mentioned the dad again. Like the dad's gone, right? There's no closure to that part of the story. And that's another indication that this is a generational story of what's passed down from generation to generation, because we kind of pivot. Really, the story is about the wife for the most part. The rest of it, she's kind of the hero.
It really is, yeah.
Yeah. And but anyway, I just think it's interesting that I kept waiting for, I don't know, some kind of closure about his mother and father, but they're never mentioned again. And so we have this pivot. It's just kind of a clear dividing line. We're moving from one generation's decisions to the next generation. And so here we are, with the wife. And yes, she goes out looking for her husband, and she finds his hunting pouch, and she knows he's gone. And I love how the story describes her grief. It says, lamenting her sorrow and wringing her hands, she called on her beloved by name, but in vain. She hurried across to the other side of the pond and called him anew. She reviled the Knicks with harsh words, but no answer followed. The surface of the water remained calm. Only the crescent moon stared steadily back at her. The poor woman did not leave the pond. With hasty steps, she paced round and round it without resting a moment, sometimes in silence, sometimes uttering a loud cry, sometimes softly sobbing. At last her strength came to an end, and she sank down to the ground and fell into a heavy sleep. Wow, that is such a great description of a wife that's doing everything in her power to get her husband back, but absolutely nothing's working.
Yeah, that's right. And this idea of why isn't the dad talked about anymore? We've seen this in other fairy tales.
Oh, right.
Right? So in One Eye, Two Eye, Three Eyes, it's like the mother suddenly is just gone. She's not even the picture anymore. Even with Red Riding Hood, where it says another time Red Riding Hood, and the mom's not even the picture anymore. Yeah. And I think it represents that idea that this is the situation that this generation created, right?
Yeah.
But the story isn't about that.
Right.
It just sets the table. And so it goes back to that idea of, it represents society. This is the status quo, but this is about the transformation of society. So that's why I don't think fairy tales feel the need to go back and say, well, what happened to the dad, right? What happened to Red Riding Hood's mom? It's like, no, that was the old generation. That was the old way of doing things, and that's about to be transformed, right?
Yeah.
It's something like that.
Yeah, well, it's also a representation that this generation's on their own now. What's done is done. The cards have been dealt to them, and there's no need in talking about the father and the mother anymore, because now we've got our own problems, and so now we're going to deal with it. And yeah, the old generation's passed, the new generation's come along, and that's what the story's about now.
Yeah. All right. So I really like this part because she collapses into a heavy sleep, and then a dream took possession of her. And she has it's really interesting because she has this dream of climbing a mountain.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Thorns are catching her feet, but when she reaches the summit, quite a different sight presented itself to her. The sky was blue, the air soft, and there sat an old woman with white hair who beckoned to her kindly. Gosh, these are classic symbols in fairy tales, right?
Yeah, here's the mountain imagery that we've talked about 100 times.
Yeah, so she has to ascend the mountain, and that represents, her connection with God. Mm-hmm. At the top of the mountain, there's an old woman, and in this case, the old woman represents divine wisdom. Mm-hmm. So she's got to draw on divine wisdom because she's so distraught. She doesn't know what to do. So then the old woman said, here's what you need to do, right? Now, what's interesting to me, and I'll get your take on this, because all that was a dream.
Right.
So then she wakes up, and then she actually has to go do these things.
Yeah.
right? And to me, I'm thinking, well, that's almost redundant, but why do you think she dreams it and then she actually has to go physically climb this mountain and physically encounter the old woman?
Right. Yeah, I thought
Do you have
about
any thoughts
that.
on that?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked it because it actually took me a couple readings before I even picked up on the fact that, yeah, it was a dream, and then she actually followed the dream. But it's something like divine inspiration or something like that. You know, dreams mean something in other cultures, not so much in American Western culture. And I'm not really sure why, but dreams are really profound in other cultures and certainly in ancient cultures. They meant something. Like you said, that lots of natural phenomenon had gods and spirits associated with them, and dreams were no different. So if you had a dream, it meant something. And I don't know, it's something like divine wisdom, and then she acted on it. She acted it out. She actually had to take the journey in the real world, what was told to her in the spiritual world.
Yeah, I guess another way to think of it is it's what we talk about with symbols. Is her dream is almost a pattern of reality. Her dream actually kind of shows her how the world is, and now she actually has to go do that thing, which is that extra step of just saying, well, I had a dream and a woman told me what to do, right?
Yeah.
It's like, no, she has to act on it. I do think there's something there. This is actually the way the world is structured, right?
Yeah, I think
you have to
you're
climb
wrong.
the mountain to attain that divine wisdom that's found in God. Like, that's reality, right? That's not just a nice thought. That's not just a dream. That's reality. And so I think it's something like that she has to have this dream, but then she has to go act on it. She has to kind of trust that this dream has showed her the way the world actually is if she will open her eyes.
Yeah, she has to act it out. I like that. The fact that she dreamt it and then she had to go do it. It's being given the pattern of reality and then actually going out and carrying it out.
This is not just a nice image. This is not just like a metaphor.
It's not a metaphor, right? It is reality. That's right.
It is reality. It's the way reality is structured. And so it's telling you this is how you have to operate in the world.
It is something more than just saying, oh, that's cool. That's what this represents. And that's what that represents. And I used to approach fairy tales as like a riddle. What does the dog mean? And what does the cat mean? And what does the witch mean? And it's like a riddle to be unlocked. But it's not that. It really is. It's a pattern of reality that's being laid out for you. And that's why I said at the beginning of it, this is like almost like a biblical story because it's so profound. And the pattern, it comes through divine inspiration. It comes through a dream. And then it's our job to act it out. Yeah, so she actually has to act that out, and she actually has to climb the mountain. And then she actually meets the old lady, which I think, we've said this before. The old woman in the fairy tale is either a witch, like our last story, right? And that's motherly instinct gone wrong, is what we narrowed that down to in The Brother and the Sister. Or it's a godmother, right? It's proper maternal wisdom. It's, at the top of the mountain where you meet God. And, of course, don't confuse the religious...
Well, think of it as, in Proverbs, wisdom is a woman, right?
Okay, yeah.
So think of it that way.
Yeah, okay, no, that's well said. So it's, where you go to the mountain and you meet God. So this is what she comes up with. She interacts now with a proper understanding of maternal wisdom. And remember, this is in contrast to that beautiful passage about she paced around the pond and she called his name and sobbed, right? What she was doing, her current wisdom was not enough. Everything she did, she yelled at the nix, tried to get the water nix to come back or something. Nothing she was doing was working. And so now she's come in contact with proper maternal wisdom, and she's going to now be equipped to go handle this problem.
Okay, so this just hit me. There's a beautiful contrast that you just brought up. What did the dad do? The dad descended into the chaos of the pond, right? And made a deal with the malevolent spirit. What does this wife do now? She ascends the mountain to divine wisdom.
Oh, wow.
To say, how do
good.
I fix this? Right? There's a big contrast right there. The dad descends and makes the bargain. She ascends and seeks out wisdom.
Yeah. Okay, so do you think that that's really one way to think about this story, is that the contrast between the miller, whose wife couldn't save him, and the son, whose wife could?
Oh, yeah. Okay.
The descent down to the mill pond and sort of his resignation about Of what use to me are riches and prosperity? And he added, if I'm to lose my child, but what can I do? It's that resignation of, yeah, but what do I do about it, right? Well,
yeah.
the wife in this does something. Well, she's inspired to do something at least. And she actually gets up and climbs the mountain where the miller just sort of resigned himself like, what do you do? At least we got a nice carriage.
Yeah, but she answers that question.
Right.
He says, what can I do? And she actually demonstrates what he could have done.
Right. And
instead
this is
of
obviously
descending.
Yeah, you ascend. And obviously we figure out a way to break the generational curse.
Yeah, that's right. You ascend, you seek out wisdom, you seek out God. You kind of like Jephthah. You admit that you are a knucklehead and you're not going to keep this stupid vow and sacrifice your daughter, right?
Right.
So you seek out wisdom.
Yeah.
And, oh, man, that's fascinating.
No, that's good. I like that.
She actually answers that question. She answers the question, but what can I do?
Right.
Oh, that's great.
Okay, so we get to the 3 items. Yeah, so she's given these 3 items one at a time. So the woman says to her, gives her 3 items. And the first one she says, I'll help you. Here's a golden comb for thee. Tarry until the full moon has risen. Then go to the mill pond, seat thyself on the shore, and comb thy long black hair with this comb. When thou hast done it, lay it down on the bank, and thou wilt see what happened. Right? So she gives her this comb, and then, of course, she gives 3 items, and she has to do this same thing every time. And this is another one where the details matter. So before we get into kind of what the comb, the flute, and the spinning wheel represents, what do you see about kind of the specific instructions that she was given? What does that represent?
Well, the thought that popped into my head was it's very much ritual, right? There's some ritual that she has to do. It's not just, hey, toss the comb on the shore. There's something very specific that she has to do each time. With the flute, she has to play a tune and then set it down. She has to spin yarn or something before she actually... So there's something, gosh, I'm not quite sure, but there's ritual. She has to put these things to use and then she has to give them up, is almost like how I would see that.
Yeah. Well, again, if the water represents balance, then all these items are kind of laid down and the water takes it away, which is a way of saying that these items, or at least what they represent, must be put in their proper balance.
Yeah. Another way to think of that is they have to be sacrificed in some sense.
Yeah. Okay,
so we'll get into what that means. But so, yeah, she has the comb and the flute and the spinning wheel. But what's also interesting that I want to get your take on is the instructions are also very specific. It says, tarry until the full moon has risen. And she says that each time. So it's not just like the next night, go do this. It's like you have to wait. You have to wait until the next full moon. So what's that, a month, right?
Yeah. So no, that's worth pointing out.
She gets these instructions. Yeah. So what do you think's behind that?
Well, I think, again, I kind of see this as this is the process to save her husband, or let's say save your marriage. And I think kind of what it's saying is that the process of saving her husband isn't a quick fix, right? How do you rescue a husband whose life is completely out of balance? Well, it's going to take time. And so we'll go through what the 3 things represent, but whatever those are, just recognize that it's going to take time, that it's not going to be say these 3 words and this magically happens. It's give each of these time. In other words, maybe you could say, don't just do the act, let it infuse into who you are. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
In other words, give this time, let this become who you are, in other words.
No, there's definitely that you have to give it time. And as I'm reading this, she says this every time when she says, here's the instructions. And then she says, then thou will see what will happen. She doesn't tell her what will happen. Right?
Yeah.
So there is this element of uncertainty. We would almost say there's this element of faith that this is the road that wisdom is telling you to go down. Wisdom's not going to tell you how everything's going to turn out. Right. But she has to do these things, we would say, on faith. And the old lady just says, if you do this, you'll see what will happen next.
Right.
But yeah, every time, I was going to say nothing happens, but every time something a little bit more happens, right? And that's another interesting thing we need to point out. But my point is that it doesn't happen just overnight, right? It's not hey, if you do this, you'll fix your marriage. It's like, well, try this and we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
Right. Which is kind of a more realistic take on things. But every time, and we can talk about this for a minute, every time something does happen, her husband emerges out of the pond a little bit further.
Right.
every time she does this.
Yeah. So it's not obvious what's going to happen, but you do see progress with what's happening. And so to your point about wisdom doesn't explain things out. You know what just popped in my head is the whole Mr. Miyagi Karate Kid, wax my car, paint my fence, sand the floor, right? You know, and right at the right at the point where he's saying, look, I'm just doing all your crappy housework. You're not teaching me how to fight. And then, of course, he shows him what he's learned through the actions, but he didn't explain, hey, wax this car because that's going to teach you how to block a punch. And you know what I mean? He just sort of does the same thing. Wax this car, and then he just walks away. And it's like the wisdom is when, what is it? Wisdom is when you see the results of intentional actions come together. Maybe that's it. It's something like that.
Yeah. I thought you were going to say this is another aspect, but wisdom is doing the right thing over and over and over again, even when you don't see an immediate payoff.
Yeah, there you go. That's a better way to say it.
Which then leads to what you just said. But there is that aspect of wisdom, or we might say integrity. Integrity is like, hey, every day doing this. You don't just have a moment of wisdom, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Wisdom is usually something that has to be practiced over and over and over again. And it's only at some future time that you actually go, oh, okay, the wise way of living is actually paying off. Something like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think of spiritual disciplines. It's hard to do these things, but you do them with the faith that there's a understanding and a payoff that is very difficult to express at the beginning. But after it, once you've done these things, once you've integrated the discipline into who you are, that's when you can start to see the effects of it.
Yeah, that's right. So in that sense, and that actually helps me understand this a lot better, because in that sense, you see the wife going through the ritual, month after month, right? Mm-hmm. New moon after new moon, doing these things, not knowing what the payoff's going to be, but she's pursuing wisdom, and so she's going to incorporate these rituals, these disciplines in her life, because I guess you could say, like, for her, the only way to get her husband back is the long game, right?
Yeah.
To be consistent and stick with this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I want to keep talking about this stuff, but I think we're going to have to get into what the comb and the flute and the spinning wheel represent, and then we'll kind of get into more of what the moon represented. I think we'll be able to tie it together. Let's jump into these three things. The big question is, what do these three items represent? I'll let you take a stab at it first.
Okay, I've gone back and forth on this, and I've had a rough idea, and then I'm trying to find the specific words, right? But
okay.
I think I'm on the right track. The comb represents, so first I'd say the comb represents beauty, right?
Okay.
But the comb represents a lot of things. So, because the act of combing your hair is bringing order to chaos also.
Yeah.
Right?
Straightening out the tangled mess.
Yeah, so there's that aspect right now, is the comb actually, I think, and in fairy tales, this is what happens. These things can have multiple layers to them. But there is this layer of the comb represents that she has to untangle this mess, right? But the comb also represents beauty, right?
Right.
But the more I thought about it, and I won't jump too far ahead, but it's also represents recognition. And I may have to explain this later. But it's something like, when something is beautiful, it grabs your attention for the moment.
Okay.
And so, like I said, we may have to circle back to this, but I'll just leave it at this for now, is that, so when he first meets her, right, mm-hmm. when any two people first lock eyes, right, there's something that captures your attention, right?
Right.
And the comb and the beauty represent that, I think. Okay? So we can put a pin in that. But do you want me to list the other two and then you go, or do you want to chime in on the comb?
Okay, so you're saying, now, just out of curiosity, you said recognition.
Yeah.
And so, okay, again, it's like, you're right. I want to explain it first and then come back and tie it together, but I know what you're saying. Or at least tell me if this is what you were thinking. His responses to all these things are just as telling as the thing themselves. So, when his head came up out of the water, it says that he looked longingly at her. And so...
Yeah, and that's the recognition. And here's where I'm going with all this. There's a pattern of these three ideas in the first act, the second act, and the third act.
Oh, yeah.
So that's why it's almost more than beauty, it's recognition. And so in the first act, that act of recognition is that he saw a beautiful maiden in the village.
Okay.
That's the comb.
Yeah.
right?
Okay. All right. Yeah, that's good. Okay, yeah, I never thought about that. I didn't at least go back to the village, to the first act, really. But where I understood that idea of recognition is his response to it. When she laid the comb down and the water swallowed it up, right? He comes up out of the water, but just his head. And it says that he didn't say anything. I thought that was interesting. He didn't speak, but he looked at her longingly, right? And so I kind of took that to mean, like you said, recognition. Or I wrote down that he paid her attention. He sees her, and not just, I looked over there and saw this person. He really, really sees her, right? That's kind of the way I got that. He paid her attention. That was the response to the comb.
Well, it's so interesting because, so I think there's a pattern of all three of these elements in each of the acts. So what you just said, I think, ties in perfectly because when did he first meet her, right? He recognized her in the village. Hey, there's a beautiful maiden. Right. And that's that glance. That's the comb. What you just said is that makes sense then, because what does he do when she lays the comb? He recognizes her, right? But it's just a glance, and then he's gone.
Yeah.
So it's almost, golly, this is so brilliant.
Yeah.
It's almost mirroring the time they first met. And of course, that's this whole, spoiler alert, that's the whole thing is, how does she pull him out? Well, it's almost like you have to go back and remember how you fell in love in the first place.
No, that's good. And then, of course, again, I realize we're jumping to the end, but y'all have already heard the story. The scales fall off his eyes in the third act, and he recognizes her again. Wow, okay.
That's the third act.
Cool.
That's the recognition,
Wow. Yeah, this is brilliant.
It is, yeah. It really is when you start unpacking it. Okay, so that's the comb, right?
But again, that makes sense why he didn't speak. Because I thought that was a little bit weird, that his head came up and it says that he didn't speak, but he looked at her longingly. But if the point of that act is to recognize, to pay her attention, then that line is not misplaced.
No, then that makes total sense.
Sure.
It's the glance across the room.
Right. Okay.
Right?
Yeah, I like that. That's good.
Yeah, that's interesting.
All right. The flute. The flute. What does that represent then?
Okay, so the flute represents... Well, one of the words I had is attention, but also enchantment.
That's
and
exactly
there's obviously
the word
something
I use.
about. Okay, that's your word too. So I differentiate attention from recognition because attention is more focused, right? Mm-hmm. It's I'm going to pay attention to this now. It's more than just, oh, hey, I like the looks of that person across the room. It's attention.
Yeah.
Right? And why I think the flute represents that is because, well, of a couple things we've said in previous fairy tales, and then I'll get your take, is when Two Eyes sings to her sisters, right? There was that moment of music transcended their, what did we say? Their ideologies, right?
Yes.
For a moment and lulled them to sleep, right?
Right.
So it's almost that enchantment, that focused attention just for a moment. And we also saw it, I think when we talked about that episode, but it's the same reason why when King David, or the shepherd David, not king yet, plays his flute before King Saul, it stills the spirit in him.
Right.
Right? It's that focused attention. It's that enchantment. We started off by talking about documentaries we were watching. The next night, I watched a Tom Petty. I love Tom Petty documentary. And there was the moment where this song came on, the beginning of Free Falling.
Yeah.
And gosh, there was just a moment of enchantment, right? Because the beginning of that song is beautiful.
Yeah.
And you just hear those opening chords, that I'm not going to attempt to do it, but those opening chords, and you just go, okay, everyone hush, everyone stop. Free Falling's about to play.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
But it's that same idea, right? It's the flute. It's the music. It's something that captures your attention. Maybe that's the better way to say it.
Well,
it
there's
totally
also
captures your attention.
Yeah, and there's also an element of music that is, when you said the Tom Petty, it popped in my head. There's an element of music that takes you to a time and a place, right? It's not just the first time you hear a great song, you're like, oh, wow, this is beautiful. I mean, it can have that effect, but what's great about great music is it usually takes you back to a time. How many times has a song come on and you've said, hey, the first time I heard this song, I was with my buddies and we were doing whatever, right? It's like it takes you back to a certain time and place. And so there's something about that idea of enchantment or the flute that also paints that picture of drawing him back to a time and a place, maybe back to that first time in the village when he saw her, right?
Yeah, that's right.
There's a little bit of that memory, is tied with music. Okay, yeah. So enchantment is exactly what I wrote down. Yes.
Okay. All right. So we're on the same page on that one. And I'll also point out that I say these are repeated in each act, and it doesn't jump out at you in the first act about, okay, there's no flute. Like they didn't have a song, right? Remember when you're growing up and dating someone, I remember when I was in high school, it's like, what's y'all's song? And I'm like, what? We have to have a song? Like we've been out twice,
Oh, wow.
But that was the thing. You remember that? Did you guys do that?
I don't remember that. I mean, I guess there's music that you liked that, again, you associate it with that time period. But yeah, you had to have an official song. I guess you had to post it on your Facebook profile or something,
a lot
right?
of couples, yeah. Well, we didn't have any of that when I was in high school. But yeah, it wasn't uncommon for a couple to have a song. That this is our song. Anyway, so back in Act 1, here's where I think it's a bit subtle, but I think it's there. In the village lived a beautiful and true-hearted maiden. Okay? Now, this idea of true-hearted, it's like that goes beyond just she was beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we talked about in fairy tales that beautiful represents actually being true-hearted. But there's something beyond beauty that had to focus his attention, enchantment, right?
Right.
And that's that idea of true-hearted. So I do think maybe, I don't know if you buy it, but I do think the flute captures that idea of she was not only a beautiful maiden, but she was true-hearted.
Yeah.
And how could he know if she's true-hearted until he gets to know her? And that's when he really falls for her, you could say.
No, that's right. Well, one, the beauty is external beauty, and the flute maybe is internal beauty, or at least ties into that, in the first act. Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, you can see from his response, the flute, his body comes all the way up. Only half of his body came out, right? And he has these outstretched arms, right? It's like he desires her.
So now he's reaching for her. Yeah.
Right. So the first time he notices her or he pays her attention. The second time he desires her. And so here's that original pattern. I think you're exactly right. It's finding that original pattern of why you fell in love to begin with. It seems to have that ring to it, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so then we're on to the spinning wheel. And this is a trickier one. I had more difficulty with this one. What did you come up with the spinning wheel?
Okay, so yeah, this is one I probably had to think the most about. So it's something like initially, and I think we both said this a while ago, is the spinning wheel basically, I want to say domestication. That's totally the wrong word, and so I came up with another word.
Okay, yeah.
And it even may sound like, a bit sexist in our modern culture. But there is something about the spinning wheel that represents proper alignment with your role in the relationship. Okay, and so the words that I came up with was alignment and orientation. So the spinning wheel represents that she is not only a pretty face, right?
Mm-hmm.
But she's also true-hearted. But the spinning wheel somehow represents that she is also properly aligned in this relationship with her marriage. Like she knows her role. Okay, and I may have to explain this for a minute.
Yeah, that sounded sexist right
you...
there. She knows her place in the kitchen. Is that what you're saying?
All right. Well, let me explain this. All right, because you may represent the thoughts of a lot of women right now going like, are you kidding me?
No, this is dead on. It is exactly what it is. And we're trying to find a right way to say it. I really do think both people have their roles. Like he's a huntsman. He's going out and putting food on the table. And she has her domestic role. But she shows him the proper balance of the role. He obviously, remember, he chased after success just like his father, and now he's out of balance, right? And she's showing him the proper way to do that. So, before you get all worked up, I mean, look, in the old world, there were proper roles for both husband and wife, and neither of them just sat around and did nothing. Or at least if you did, you're the fisherman and his wife, right? But it's like things get out of whack. So it is more difficult to talk about it in this modern day because the fear that you're saying, get the wife back in the kitchen or whatever, clean the floors. But back then it's like the wife took care
Make
of
me a sandwich.
Yeah, right. The wife took care of the work that had to be done within the home, and the husband took care of the work that had to be done outside in the fields, outside the home. And I think that seems like a reasonable balance, I don't know.
Yeah, well, it was the balance for thousands and thousands of years. Now, I'm not saying it's the right balance for today because, people have careers and all. But here's the thing that really helped it make sense to me, and it actually frames this entire story. So maybe getting ahead of myself. But in the Odyssey, so Odysseus leaves Troy, right? And he sets on this 10-year journey to get back to Ithaca. Well, waiting at home for him is his wife Penelope. And if you know the story of the Odyssey, Penelope, what is she spending her time doing? She's at her loom weaving a tapestry. Right?
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Okay, so, and this is why I think it's so important to understand this, because this is what the spinning wheel represents. Now, if you know the story of the Odyssey, Penelope at her loom weaving a tapestry is not just woman's work. It's not a picture of like a sewing circle, right?
Right.
Although that's popular now, I was at a coffee shop yesterday, and the gal at the next table, she got some yarn and started knitting.
Yeah, you came across a literal sewing circle. I thought that was kind of done away with. All right.
Yeah, that's right. I know it was popular for a while, but apparently it still is. And hey, there's nothing wrong with that. But back to Penelope, right? So if you know the Odyssey, what is the tapestry that she's weaving? What does that represent? It's not just busy work. She's actually fending off all the suitors who want to take her husband's kingdom from her. They're telling her her husband's dead, right? Mm-hmm. She's protecting her son, Telemachus, because they're bullying him around, and he's starting to grow up and become a man, but he doesn't know his place in the world. So all of that is captured in this idea of Penelope at her tapestry.
And doesn't she undo it every night? Like, because
she
I think
undoes it every night.
Yeah, the point of it was that once she's done, then she'll take a suitor. She was basically, I forget the specifics of it, you would know better than me, but that she tells her suitors, yes, I know I need to take a suitor, I know that this has to be done, but I need to finish this tapestry first. And then behind the scenes, she undoes whatever sewing progress she made that day. She undoes it every night.
That's right, yeah. So the tapestry, or you could think the idea of the spinning wheel, is the same thing. It represents more than just she's part of a knitting club, right?
Right.
It represents her protection of the home, her protection of her son, Telemachus, her protection of the kingdom while her husband is away. And it also represents her cunning, right?
Okay.
It's the female cunningness that says, look, I'm not going to pick a fight with these guys, but I am going to outwit them.
Right.
And again, do any kind of research into the Odyssey. That's what Penelope at her loom represents. And I think the spinning wheel represents something very similar here.
Okay. No,
Does that make sense?
Well, you went way deeper than me. Mine was a much shallower take, but I do like that. But to your point about the cunning or the thought behind it, like I said, mine's a little bit more simplistic. A spinning wheel takes loose individual fibers and spins them into a functional thread, right? And so it's this image of resourceful productivity, right? And again, all these items are laid at the water's edge and swallowed by the pond. So that's a way of saying they're put in their proper balance. And so, again, if the husband's problem was imbalance, right, that he made this bargain of prosperity for life, and he's been pulled into the water, he's completely out of balance, what's the best way to pull him out of it? Because the spinning wheel is what pulls him out, right? And I think it's because when he saw...
That's right.
Yeah, and I think it's because when he saw that her productivity was in the proper balance, that he could do the same, right? What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's right. I think that's right. It's not so much productivity. I think it is actually your role in the household.
Yeah.
And look, everyone has a role in the household, right?
Right.
So we've seen their relationship progress from like, there's a cute guy or there's a cute girl across the room to now I got to know them and now I'm kind of enchanted. But you know that once you get married or once you establish a relationship, you're both going to have roles to play in that. And there's a lot of give and take in that. And I think the spinning wheel represents her role. And to your point, it's proper. It's her properly balanced role in the relationship. And in a way, it's like she's modeling what this looks like.
Right.
Because the counterpart to that, we've talked about the pattern, is her working the spinning wheel is him being the huntsman. And we know that he got out of balance with that.
Right. Yeah,
right?
I think that's it.
That took him down the wrong path. Yeah, I think it makes total sense.
Yeah. Okay, so to summarize, you got the comb, that's that sort of external beauty. The flute is that enchantment, and then the spinning wheel is her role or each of their roles in this relationship. So if you're going to say beauty is the most shallow thing, then obviously when you find your role in the relationship and you get in the groove, right, and you have expectations of each other and you call out the best in each other and you both find your roles, that's the depth of the relationship. And so you can kind of see this ever deepening pattern going on with these three things. Okay, I like that.
Yeah, I think that makes total sense. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So now let's go back to the wait until the full moon has risen. Now, when we put all these pieces together, in other words, the process of saving your husband isn't a quick fix. We already said that. But, how do you save the husband whose life is out of balance? Well, you become a wife that's beautiful, enchanting, and resourceful. And you recognize that it's going to take some time doing that. You're going to actually demonstrate it. It's not just a quick flash of beauty or a quick flash of resourcefulness. We're going to weave these into our lives and actually become these things. And once you do that, you become the model for your husband to look at, and that pulls him back into balance, right? It's something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I like that idea of faithful adherence to wisdom day after day after day, the consistency of it.
Yeah.
Not guaranteeing the outcome.
Right.
But it's going to take that consistency of, following the path of wisdom. Yeah, I think that makes total sense.
Yeah, trust the process.
Trust the process, that's right. Use a coaching slogan there.
Yeah, that's right.
All right, so anything else about Act 2, or should we jump in and finish the story? Because, hey, there's a lot.
Oh, I know. We could go on and on. But yeah, let's move on to Act 3 kind of because, I don't know, there's fascinating stuff all through this. But yeah, let's jump into Act 3. So the husband comes out. He gets pulled out of the water. He grabs her hand and happily ever after, right?
All kinds of crazy stuff starts to happen. But yeah, this is another point where in a fairy tale, you'd go, okay, they're about to wrap things up. And then no,
everything goes sideways now. Right.
This was a hard one to figure out, right? So she pulls him out of the water and they start to leave, but then, and it describes, but they had scarcely gone a very little distance. Then the whole pond rose with a frightful roar and streamed out over the open country and basically floods everything. And then there's this really, there's so many little interesting things here because she cries out to the old woman, which is saying a prayer, right? Because they're running away, the flood's coming. What does she do? She cries out to wisdom. She says a prayer, right?
Right.
What do we do? And the woman transforms him into a frog and her into a toad. There's a lot there that we could talk about.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. Do you have a take on the meaning of the frog and the toad? Why not just two frogs? Do you think that's intentional? Maybe that's what I'm saying.
I hadn't really thought about one a frog and one a toad, but there is something like they're still separate, right?
Yeah.
We think they're together, but they're not. And that's what's going to happen here because this torrent basically pushes them to different ends of the kingdom, you could say.
Right.
And when the flood recedes, they become people again, but now they're still separate. So I think something like the toad and the frog represent that they're not quite together yet, right?
Yeah, I kind of looked at it like they are both made for water, but in different ways, right? She doesn't turn them into birds so that they can fly away. But a frog and a toad, they're going to get washed away, but they're suited for the water without being drowned. And so I think the distinction between one's a frog and one's a toad is sort of like saying you're both equipped to handle this, but you're going to handle it in slightly different ways.
Okay, yeah, I could see that too.
I mean, that's kind of the way I say it. Okay, I guess I'm saying at this point in the story, I think the generational curse has been broken, right? He's out of the water. But it's not quite happily ever after yet, right? Life and marriage are still hard. They're still going to lose each other for a while, but they're both equipped to survive the chaos in their own way. That's the way I saw the frog and the toad.
Well, I was going a little bit, it's hard to talk about any one thing in this last act without summarizing the whole act as a whole because it all ties together.
Yeah, well, we can do that.
This is one where, this is one where the first time I read this, it's like, okay, the lake explodes and floods everything. They turn into frogs. They're on separate sides of the kingdom and both become shepherds. And I'm just like, what the heck is going on? Like, what? Did I just start a different fairy tale?
Yeah, right.
But everything actually ties together. And I guess we can maybe try and attempt that. So let's start with the pond overflows and floods everything.
Okay.
Right? So it ties back to the flute, I think, because, and again, we got to jump ahead a little bit because all this ties together. But one of the ways they recognize each other is he plays a song on the flute, right?
Right.
Okay, so he has the flute. He has the golden flute, which means that he took it from the lake. Okay?
Yeah, I
So
didn't
if
even
you
think about that, but sure.
Yeah, so if you see him being dragged down by the Nix of the Mill Pond as a descent to the underworld, which that's essentially what it is, right?
Right.
Then if you know your mythological rules, you can't take things from the underworld. And if you do, then the king of the underworld gets very upset with you. Okay?
Oh, okay. Yeah,
So-
you're saying that
and
he
you see
tried to
this-
sneak out the flute.
So he sneaks the flute out, right? And it's at that point where the Nix of the Mill Pond realize that she's been basically conned. So something that was offered in sacrifice to her, right? The golden flute, the golden comb,
Right.
he snuck that out. And so
Oh,
I
that's
think
cool.
that's what's happening here.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. That's actually really, I didn't pull all that together. I mean, when you said that he had the flute, I was like, oh, yeah, I guess he does have it at the end, but not the comb and the spinning wheel. But yeah, he snuck the flute
Yeah.
out. And so, yeah, the Nix is pissed.
Yeah, that's right. Right. He just incurred the wrath of the Nix because it's like, okay, she's been conned. Not only did she pull him out of the underworld, and again, like you go back to the Odyssey, like Odysseus has to descend to the underworld, right, at one point. So that's kind of part of this theme. But he also takes something from the underworld. And so that causes chaos. And that makes sense, right? Because what is chaos? The world floods,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But then I think this is brilliant, the way the story's written, because then she cries out for help to wisdom. Well, how do you survive the flood? Well, she turns them into creatures who can survive in water.
Right.
and
Water
in land,
creatures.
right?
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
And so
Well-
all of a sudden, like, it makes perfect sense.
No, it does. That's actually really good. Mine was, I mean, I kind of had this idea of just the chaos of marriage. Because again, I'm going with this marital, generational baggage. You find somebody, you fall in love, but it's not easy. You work at it, and you know,
Oh, yeah,
sometimes you grow apart, and then of course you rediscover each other. So I'm going with that theme. So I'm just kind of looking at the water as just sort of the chaos of marriage, you know. But I think, no, I like the underworld tie-in, and you're right. If you know your mythological rules, you know you can't take anything out of the underworld, and I think that's exactly what's going on here.
Yeah, because it says the shepherd, we're jumping ahead, but it says the shepherd pulled the flute out of his pocket. And it's like, well, why does he have the flute?
Yeah.
He took it from the underworld.
Where did he stick it when
was
he
in
was
his-
a frog? Answer me that, mythological master.
Yeah, okay. So that's the bonus question, right? That's our listeners. If you can answer that question, tell us, how he hid the... There's an old joke in there somewhere.
Yeah.
But yeah, answer that riddle there. Where did he put the flute while he was a frog? That's hilarious.
Yeah. Okay, so no, that's really good. I like that.
Well, I would say what you're doing is you're going right to the practical application of all this, because that is the practical application of all this backstory that I'm talking about, right?
Right.
So it's not necessarily different takes, because ultimately I am with you that this is about a marriage relationship and how to save it. And ultimately that, yes, that's where all this is going, what you just said, right?
Right.
I'm more stuck on the symbolic elements. So I just say that to say that we're not saying two different things. We're actually, I think, pretty much in alignment on this.
No,
We're just
when-
talking about different aspects of it.
Yeah, when your life is out of balance, when there's chaos, you're in the underworld. I mean, that's what that means.
Yeah, that's
you
right.
know. So anyway, yeah. Okay, so they get separated. They go to distant lands, and then they go back to their human form. And I think it's funny that it says that they wake up and they're kind of around strangers that don't speak the same language as them. Was there anything to that?
Oh,
that you,
I didn't really catch that. No,
Yeah,
but you're right.
yeah. They're in
Wow,
a
what do you
strange
think's
land.
going on there?
I don't know. I just I looked at that and I thought, okay, how does that play into, especially if we're going to this relationship thing? If you're assuming that this is about a marriage, and I think it is, and you're married to somebody, they're obviously still married, right? They're coming home from work every day. They're passing each other every night, but they're around strangers that don't speak the same language. I think that's a way of saying that's where their relationship had gone. You know, and we've all seen, we've all kind of seen relationships like that. Maybe your own relationship has had a season that way where, you know, I don't know, we talk, but man, we are not communicating. You know what I mean? And that's the way
I could see
that's
that.
the vibe I got from that.
It's like we've done the hard work. She's pulled me back in, but we're kind of in new territory, you could say.
Right.
And, well, I mean, look, one of the things I've said before, too, is like in relationships, especially if you get married young, you both grow and mature, but sometimes it happens at different points, right?
Yeah.
And so one person's growing and the other person's not, and then they grow, and those times where people are growing, kind of maturing in the relationship at different, what would you say, a different pace, at a different pace.
Yeah.
It's almost like there are those moments where you're like, I feel like I'm in the house with a stranger, right?
Yeah.
But we're trying to figure this out. Maybe it's something like that.
No, I think that is it. Well, okay, so then to move on to the next step, they both became shepherds. And I kind of took this, I don't know if you took it this way, but I don't know. There's something about they both raised sheep. So do you think that means children came along?
Oh, wow.
Did you get that vibe at all?
Could be. I didn't think about children came along, but I do think the role of shepherd, it's almost back to the most basic level of understanding your role in the relationship. So for him, he was a huntsman, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in my mind, shepherd is a step down from a huntsman.
I don't know if
that's the case, but in my mind, I would rather be a huntsman. That sounds a lot more cool than a shepherd, right?
Well, yeah, heck yeah.
And so, in a weird way too, I think the spinning wheel, like this is where it ties back to those three elements, because in this new reality, it's not her at a spinning wheel. It's not Penelope at the tapestry. It's the most basic of care for the family, right? So she's a shepherd too. It's something like that. Does that make sense? But you're right. It may involve that kids come along.
Well, when you said that.
But they don't know each other either. So.
Yeah. But also, you're right. The spinning wheel is the production of taking wool and spinning it into functional thread. And again, it's almost like you're going back to the more fundamental role. Now she's raising sheep.
Yeah, that's right.
As opposed to spinning wool or spinning thread or whatever, Yeah, there may be something like that. I don't know. It could be multiple things, but I took it to mean sort of the raising of children. It's like, okay, so the most likely time for a divorce, they say, is in the first 5 years of marriages. And that's not a real surprise, right? You married the wrong person, whatever it is, and you start living together, you start fighting, right? The divorce happens. But the interesting thing is that the second most likely time to get a divorce is around 20 years of marriage. And if you think about that, you're like, well, that's kind of strange. You would think that the longer you're married, the likelihood of divorce simply goes down, right? But there's not. There's a big spike in divorces around the time that kids are grown and leaving the house. And so it's kind of this moment of you put all your energy into raising the kids. You find out that you don't know your husband or your wife anymore because all you're doing is dealing with kids and making sure that they're on the straight and narrow and raising them. And then when they go, you have this moment where you don't know your wife or you don't know your husband. You have to rediscover each other. And so I think that this being washed away, different lands, don't speak the language, raising sheep, I think that's kind of what that's saying. It's the chaos of raising a family, drifting apart. To your point about they seem to be steps backwards in their roles, it's almost like, yeah, that's a good point. You may be a doctor or a lawyer, but when you have kids, you're changing diapers and cleaning up throw up. You know what I mean? And so it's sort of a back to the basics type thing. And yeah, they drift apart just like it probably happens in any relationship. That's the way I view this whole third act.
Okay, yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right, and you can also think of it in terms of we've been through a hard time together, we've done the hard work, we've been to therapy maybe, he's cut back on his hours, she's trying to do better, whatever the case may be, but it's almost like, okay, now we're in this uncomfortable, it's like I don't really know who this new person is, right?
Right. Yeah.
It's like this is what I wanted and fought for, but at the same time it's like I've got to get to know this person again now or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. And to your idea about the three items represented in each act, now we have the three items pop back up again. The comb,
that's right,
the flute, and the spinning wheel. So, well, I'll let you take it away. So they obviously happen to stumble across each other, right? Which I think is funny because if you're in a faraway land, you don't stumble across each other. But again, the faraway land is metaphorical. You can be in the same room but miles apart, right? That's just the way the saying goes.
Yeah, faraway land.
Yeah, exactly.
That's right.
So they see each other, and then I think it's interesting that they not just see each other. It says they met in a valley, but they didn't recognize each other, but they rejoiced because they were no longer lonely. And then it says they brought their flocks to the same place, but they didn't speak much, but they felt comforted. See, I think that's a very specific line. You know what I mean? If you run into somebody, first of all, you're with people that you can't speak to. You're surrounded by strangers, right? That's that whole language difference. And now you come across somebody else. Imagine going to a foreign country, and this has actually happened to me. You go to a foreign country where they're speaking a different language, and then you see somebody on the street saying whatever, "Hey, taxi, over here, I need you." You know, I'd be like, "Oh, hey, you speak my language. Where are you from? You sound like you're from the States, right?"
Yeah, and do you want to have coffee? Do you want to have dinner with me?
Right. But I think it's funny that in this story, they don't speak much. And it's like, why would you not be speaking your head off when you've been surrounded by people who speak a different language? But the reason is because that's a way of saying they're starting to reconnect. You know, they're starting to rediscover who they are, but they're not speaking much yet. The communication lines aren't completely open.
Yeah, that's right. That makes sense. They're together, but they're not speaking the same language yet.
Yeah. Well, yeah,
which again is captured in that basic of role of they're both shepherds at this point. He's not a huntsman yet.
Right.
She's not weaving a beautiful tapestry yet, right?
Right.
And so they're together, but they're not speaking the same language. Yeah.
Which plays right in line with the fact that they don't recognize each other either, because that's another thing. You're like, how do you not recognize your wife or your husband, right? But obviously that's metaphorical, but they're also not speaking the same language. So I think that's kind of interesting.
Okay, so then it all wraps up. And this is an interesting detail. It said, one evening when the full moon was shining.
Yeah,
Okay,
there's that moon motif again.
Yep, everything has happened on a full moon. The shepherd pulled his flute out of his pocket. Again, we have the great mystery of where it was when he was a frog. And he played on it a beautiful but sorrowful air. And when he had finished, this is actually a beautiful ending of the story. He saw that she was weeping bitterly. And he said, "Why are you weeping?" And she said, "Thus shone the full moon when I played this air on the flute for the last time, and the head of my beloved rose out of the water." That's a great line.
It is.
Then he looked at her, and it seemed as if a veil fell from his eyes, and he recognized his dear wife. That's they embraced and kissed, and now we get to the happily ever after, right?
Right. But in fact, I love the last line. No one need ask if they were happy.
Oh, yeah, that's a great line. Don't even bother asking. You know,
we're not even going to say, and they lived happily ever after, because that's a given,
you
right?
Get the picture.
After that narrative, yeah.
So again, this happens on a full moon. And again, like it's a very important detail that he has the flute in his pocket. And so we have the spinning wheel, we have the flute, and then we have, again, that comb, the recognition, right?
Right.
Which is that moment when the veil fell from his eyes and he recognized his dear wife. And so we have the three elements there in this last act too. I think it's brilliant.
No, I think
the way
this
was written.
Yeah, amazingly crafted. And it's one of these stories that, again, when you read it for the first time, there's something that calls to you. It's interesting, but of course you can't untangle it in one sit down with it. But the more you sit down with it, the more you see the patterns, and the more, man, I want to know who wrote this, because whoever did it is absolutely brilliant and was able to have this recurring theme throughout and this kind of these multiple layers throughout. And yeah, I just think it's a brilliant story, and it certainly ends with the happily ever after.
Yeah, that's right. And I like the fact, the other reason I think it's brilliant is I like the fact that the symbols are subtle. You have to pull them out, but it's also what makes you dig for them because you know they're there.
Right.
Sometimes I watch a movie and, you know, one of the characters will say something or do something, and you go, they're subtly referencing this. And then the character basically explains what just happened. And you're like, you just ruined it. You just ruined the moment because you're trying to explain this movie to the dumbest person watching it, right?
Yep, exactly.
And so there's something about the art of subtlety that this fairy tale captures that I like it. It's like if it were a movie, you'd have to watch it several times and go, did you see it this time? Did you catch this time? You know? Because they don't over-explain anything, but it's all there.
Well, one of the things I would encourage the listeners to do is to go back and read it. And with all of our insights, and go back and read it. And again, the last time I read it, that's when I noticed the difference between the frog and the toad. I'm like, I'm certain there's a reason for every specific word, every detail. And so you kind of dig into that and you're like, just for brevity's sake, why wouldn't you say she turned them into frogs? You know, but I think it's a way of holding on to that thread of they're going to be able to survive this chaos, this water chaos, because they're going to be created for the water, but they're going to be done in slightly different ways, right? The husband-wife dynamic. Anybody who's married knows a guy thinks about something from one direction and a gal thinks about it from another direction, and that's kind of what makes marriage both infuriating and it helps us grow and wonderful at the same time, right? I mean, that we have these two different ways of looking at things. And that's what I kind of pulled from The Frog and the Toad. But there's just a dozen little details like that,
I know.
You and I were talking beforehand. It was like, should we talk about this? Should we talk about that? And it's like, golly, we're never going to get through it if we do that. I mean,
that's right.
We're a couple hours into this and there's still details to be talked about. But that's it in a nutshell. And I really think we captured the meaning behind it because all of the symbols and details make sense once you kind of plug it into that framework.
Yeah, that's right. And we've talked about before how you can tell if you're on the right track with what something means if a light bulb comes on and it illuminates everything around it, right?
Yeah.
And so I felt like that's what happened with this story, with the takes that both of us were taking on it, because it's like every little detail now pretty much makes sense to me. And the first time I read it, I certainly did not have that sense.
Oh, yeah.
There was a lot of head scratching the first time I read it.
Yeah, you had a feeling about it. And you said earlier that you had the idea that, man, this means something. I want to come back and dig. And that was sort of the fun of kind of dissecting this story, is we had a chance to really kind of read it several times. And of course, we talk about it off air and kind of dig and figure out what it means. There's just a satisfaction when it's like that Lego click. I've said that before. When that Lego clicks together, you're like, that's it. These two things were made for each other. And that's when you understand the symbols, that's the satisfaction you get from it.
Well, my final thought is just the fact that we've talked about all this stuff, but just stepping back, I don't know, it really jumps out at you that she is the hero of this story.
Oh, no doubt.
And that's why I love the contrast or the comparison with Penelope in the Odyssey, because she's meant to be not just a domesticated housewife in that story. She's meant to be one of the heroes of the story that protects the kingdom. And in a very similar way, I think she is undoubtedly, the wife here is undoubtedly the hero in this story. The lengths that she goes to, we talked about the full moons, the time spans, the lengths that she goes to fight to save this relationship. I don't know. Kudos to her.
Yeah.
Well, that's definitely the hero.
That's why I read that section where she's walking around the pond and sobbing. Sometimes she's screaming out loud. Sometimes she's silent. Because once you understand that this is a wife trying to save her marriage, man, that resonates. It resonates deeper than if you just took on face value that her husband's been swallowed up by this water pond, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And so it was just so deep when you understand that, yeah, she's fighting for her marriage.
Yeah, wow. All right, so we have one more to go.
Okay, what are we doing next episode?
We are doing King Thrushbeard.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Well, so this one, I think the moral of the story is fairly obvious, but it's also a beautiful picture that has a lot of biblical parallels. Let's put it that.
So like Red Riding Hood, the surface moral is fairly obvious, but then there's all kinds of subtleties to it. You know, one thing that I'm glad you brought up King Thrushbeard, because I kind of wish we had, at the end of every episode, said what we were going to read next, because that would give the listener a chance to go dissect it yourself before you listen to the episode and see if you come up with some of the same things we did. That's been the fun of this is, well, Red Riding Hood, there's a lot of people out there having that conversation. But with some of these others, man, it's difficult to find information on it. You know what I mean? And so I'm plugging into Chat GPT sometimes, like, what would the significance of this be? And so, it would be more interesting if you could sit down and read it and have these thoughts on it yourself and then listen to the episode. So next couple weeks, go out and read King Thrushbeard and see if you can find the same patterns, taking all the information from the previous episodes that we've kind of tried to point out about symbolism, things like that. See what you can come up with that. And join us in a couple weeks.
Yeah, and as we said last time too, all you got to do is Google them. They're all online. You can find them if you just Google King Thrushbeard. You'll be able to read it online. And if you're enjoying this series, tell your friends. This is a little bit different series than we've done in the past, but I have thoroughly enjoyed it. So if you're enjoying it, the best way to get word out is word of mouth. Recommend this podcast to people who you think would enjoy it. And we'll talk to you next episode.
All right. We'll see you next time.